Hey guys, thanks for stopping by my channel. Today I'm going to adjust the valves on my Interceptor 650 for the first time. The bike has about 800 miles on it now, and the first thing I'm going to do is remove the fuel tank. You can use the key to the bike to remove the side panel, and there's a pull tab right next to the toolkit. You simply pull on it and lift the seat, and it comes right out. Now I'm going to remove these two bolts holding the back of the tank, and they're size 10 millimeter. Once you get the bolts out of the back of the tank, you can lift it up a little bit. There's a vent line right here that won't let the tank go any further, and there's one on the other side too, so we need to remove these first. Next, we can go ahead and disconnect this electrical connection. That's going to be the fuel pump. There are a couple other things I couldn't get a light to show you, but they need to be disconnected, and I'll show you once I get the tank off. So once you do get everything disconnected, you can lift the tank up in the back, push it forward just a little bit and pull up, and it'll come right off. So the last two connections I couldn't show you are going to be this green connector right here. This goes to the fuel gauge, and then the fuel line is going to connect right here to this barb. There's actually a button on the hose that stays connected to the tank. You just push it and it's a quick release. The next thing we need to do before we can remove the valve cover is there's an electrical sub-assembly right here. We don't need to remove it, but we need to take these three bolts out. That way we can lift it up a little bit to get the valve cover out of the bike. Since I'm going to turn the motor over by hand and I don't want to fight the compression, I'm going to go ahead and remove the spark plugs. Now we can remove the four bolts that secure the valve cover. They're size 8 millimeter, and there's two on this side and two on the other side of the bike. When you get the four bolts out of the valve cover, you can simply pull up and the valve cover will release. There's a rubber gasket underneath. You want to be sure not to damage this because we're going to have to put it back. It's a really tight fit up against the frame, but once you get it maneuvered around, you want to pull it out of the left side of the bike. To complete the next step, you're going to need a 14 millimeter hex bit, and we're going to remove the access plate on the side of the motor. Once you remove the access cover, there's a rubber O-ring inside. You don't want to lose that. Now if you look inside the access port, there's a 17 millimeter hex head bolt inside. That's how you crank the motor by hand. When you turn the motor over by hand, you always want to turn the motor counterclockwise, never clockwise. And when you turn the motor over at the crank, there's a dial up here by the valves, and it's got an R for right and an L for left inscribed into it. So as you spin the crank, you line up the indicator line with the R on top, and that means the valves on the right side of the bike are ready to work on. You continue to turn it and line up the indicator line with the L, and then the left side of the bike is ready for the valves to be worked on. When I turn the motor over by hand, this dial right here is going to spin. Remember, always turn the motor counterclockwise. You can actually feel it come off the lobes and the pressure release once you get to a certain point. And it's really hard to see, but there is an L at the top And that line in the dial, that is your indicator line that you would line up going horizontally. Now that this L is right here and the indicator line is lined up to the right, the valves on the left side of the bike are ready to work on. To get the clearance right on the valves, you're going to need a set of these feeler gauges. I got these at Harbor Freight. They're really cheap. And you're going to need a .003 for the intake and a .007 for the exhaust. I'm going to start with the intake valves on the left side of the bike, and the intake valves are the ones closest to the intake, and your exhaust valves are the ones closest to the exhaust. Now I'm going to take the .003 feeler gauge and I'm going to check the intake valves. If you've never done this before, you've got to get used to the feel of it, but you're going to insert the gauge right underneath this ball and it should go in fairly easy. You don't want too much tension on the gauge and you don't want it too loose either. It should just fit perfectly, touching the top and the bottom. So this valve is actually good. Now I'll check the second one. And this side is adjusted well too. Next I'll take the .007 feeler gauge and I'm going to check the exhaust valves. Like I said, it should go in fairly easy. This one goes in, but it is over tight. When I pull on it, it doesn't move very easily at all. So I'm going to adjust this one. To adjust the valve, I'm going to take a screwdriver and put it in this slot. Then you can use a size 10 wrench to break this nut. Once the retaining nut's loose, I'm going to spin the screwdriver to loosen it up a little bit and get the feeler gauge back in there. And now I will tighten up the tension on the feeler gauge. Again, you don't want too much pressure and you don't want too little pressure either. Once you get the measurement right, go ahead and tighten up the retaining nut. Hold the screwdriver in place so it doesn't spin and just tighten up the retaining nut and make sure you get it really tight. Now take the feeler gauge and test it again, and if you need to, adjust the valve until you get it right. Once you get the valves adjusted on the left side of the bike, turn the crank counterclockwise and then line up the R on the dial and you're ready to work on the right side of the bike. I've already done the right side of the bike. I ended up having one valve that was adjusted correctly and I had 2 exhaust valves and 1 intake valve that were too tight. Now I'm going to start putting the bike back together, then we'll start it up and we'll see how it sounds. Make sure you've got the O-ring inside the access cover before you put it back on. You can go ahead and check the gap on the spark plugs while you got them out. Be sure to put the screws back in the electrical subassembly. So now I've got the bike back together and I'm going to start it up and we'll see how it's running. that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, go ahead, click subscribe, and stay up to date with my latest videos. Well, thanks again, and have a wonderful day.